Racism is often seen as disliking somebody because of their race and voicing your opinion about it. However, it is actually much more than that, and there are many types. One way to gain an understanding about race is with an iceberg metaphor. Think of it this way. The tip of the iceberg is very obvious racial acts, such as calling people slurs or giving someone death threats. This is called interpersonal racism. Just like the tip of an iceberg, interpersonal racism is visible, and for the most part it's harmful only on a personal level. However, the rest of the iceberg, which lies below sea level, is structural racism. This form of racism, which is a type of systemic racism, isn't seen day to day, however it is still very harmful, just like the below water part of the iceberg. According to an organization called Race Forward, structural racism is defined as racial bias among institutions and across society. It involves the cumulative and compounding effects of an array of societal factors, including the history, culture, ideology, and interactions of institutions and policies that systematically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. Examples of structural racism are things like the biased criminal justice system, lack of or poor employment for people of color, and voter suppression, and more. The bottom portion of an iceberg isn't easy to get rid of, and nor is structural racism. However, there are ways to make changes about structural racism and organizations that will help.
According to the Aspen Institute, structural racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. Structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. Institutional racism refers to the policies and practices within and across institutions that, intentionally or not, produce outcomes that chronically favor or put a racial group at a disadvantage. Poignant examples of institutional racism can be found in school disciplinary policies in which students of color are punished at much higher rates than their white counterparts, in the criminal justice system, and within many employment sectors in which day-to-day operations, as well as hiring and firing practices, can significantly disadvantage workers of color. Structural racism relates to institutional racism because institutional racism falls under structural racism. The policies of institutional racism are what allow structural racism to exist. It is one of the many parts making structural racism be a thing and helping racism to adapt to our current time period. According to ncbi.nlm.nah.gov, the dangers of structural racism are social segregation, the immigration policy, and an intergenerational drag. Morello, Frosch, and Jesdale found that segregation increased the risk of cancer related to air pollution because of residential segregation concentrating poverty and air pollutants. Another example is segregation of workplaces tracking minority workers into jobs with fewer benefits and more danger. Immigrant employees often work in segregated environments that are dangerous and stressful, which can lead to heart disease. Next, the USA immigration policy has reinforced the social hierarchy in the health of populations. The exclusion from non-whites from citizenship makes it so the majority of people voting are white. The rights of racial minorities are heavily influenced by the immigration policy. Racial stereotypes have greatly influenced the immigration policy. The racist actions and inequities experienced by one generation may be felt across subsequent generations. Intergenerational drag views contemporary disparities as the cumulative effects of macro-level systems interacting with one another in ways that generate and sustain racial inequalities. Intergenerational drag research attempts to determine what fraction of a contemporary disparity is attributable to a historical event. It examines not only the losses of one group, but also the corresponding gains by another group.
According to Philanthropy News Digest, groups such as Living Cities, Government Alliance on Race and Equity, Race Forward, and Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society have all committed to an action plan on a national level to create a solution to an end to structural racism. They plan on working with communities and workplaces with the help of racial equity tools to change the gap between races and move forward to position all races' efforts together to create for expedited results. Nonprofits have started installing their action plans in cities such as Grand Rapids, Philadelphia, and Austin. In an action plan, people are taught about the government's accountability towards creating racial equity policies, financial plans based off of racial equity tools, and the creation of interdepartmental groups, which are made up of many different races to better represent and create for the best results of all racial groups. This solution is and will be effective based off of actual data collected from cities that are already working on their national plan, according to Philanthropy News Digest. Action plans are a very effective solution, and based off of their statistics so far, they've made great progress, so much so that they've been featured in the national news multiple times. Although they are an effective solution, they may not be the most realistic in the long run until multiple changes have been made to them. This is because so far the only downside is that there is no long-term results, but you have to keep in mind that action plans have only been around since June 19th of 2018, so long-term data has not been able to be collected yet. Another solution to end structural racism has been made by the Center for American Progress. They have stated that many factors need to be considered to go into fixing structural racism. One of the most significant factors to change will be expanding housing and home ownership among Black families. Ever since the Great Depression, house ownership has been a large means for families when trying to build up their wealth. Banks and other financial institutions expanding their access to other communities would also provide housing to be more affordable, which could help a larger community move towards being able to buy their own homes. To do this, the Center for American Progress states that supporting and defending deliberate policy changes for equitable housing would be critical. By improving the wealth of Black families, it would fix many of the issues created by structural racism in our society. Some of the issues being fixed would include improving the college attendance gap, employment rates would increase, and the income rates would become racially equivalent. This solution could and also would be very effective when integrated into businesses and communities. This is due to the very clear connection between wealth and the accessibility to everyday and common things we see in our daily lives. In order to make this a realistic solution, very concrete laws and policies would have to be made in order to make this a realistic solution. The solutions created by the Center for American Progress and the Philanthropy News Digest are both effective and can be very realistic solutions if we work towards them, and they can make a start to end structural racism once and for all.
Education plays a large role in working towards these solutions. To be able to have these solutions, students need to be educated on racial equity tools. There are many organizations and companies that have developed how to use racial equity tools to make racial equality in all aspects. In schools, especially in classes such as African American history, these skills can be taught and incorporated.
Some of these skills include how to address hate and discrimination in a work environment, ways to work towards criminal justice against structural racism, economic development and security for all races, changes one can make in their own environment individually, and how to create accountability and community assessment tools.
By teaching these skills in schools, especially starting at a young age, kids are able to realize, fix, and address problems created in their lives created by structural racism.